Run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast, run them jewels fast,
Welcome to the Week 17 edition of the Sharp Football Analysis Podcast. My name is Warren Sharp of SharpFootballAnalysis.com. And guys, we have almost made it. The regular season is ending in mere days, but this podcast does not end. This podcast will continue to go. NFL postseason. We'll be breaking down games each and every single week with our good friend Evan Silva from rotoworld.com. In this edition of the podcast, I highly encourage you to check out what we're going to be sharing with you. We are first going to be covering with Evan Silva strategies for Week 17, strategies for the wild card round. We're going to talk about the firing of Chip Kelly. We're going to talk about pivotal playoff seeding matchups this week in the NFL Week 17. We're going to dive into a few games that don't necessarily have as many playoff potential, but still are going to be intriguing storylines from a betting or daily fantasy perspective. And lastly, we're going to touch on DFS fades and plays that Evan Silva likes. But before we get into Week 17 and before we get into the talk about the NFL playoffs, two things. Number one, this is being sent out on Thursday morning. I'm standing here recording this podcast on Thursday morning. Evan and I had a phone call Wednesday evening. That means it is now New Year's Eve. And guys, if you're anything like most of the majority of the public, you are really getting fired up for New Year's Eve. You got college playoff games this afternoon and this evening, and then you're going to be looking to go out on the town and celebrate and have a blast. And I really do strongly encourage you guys to enjoy yourselves tonight. There aren't many opportunities, particularly as sports bettors and maybe some of you daily fantasy guys, to really enjoy the laurels, the accomplishments that you've achieved, because everything is always on to the next. What have you done for me lately? Continue building the bankroll and don't really rest on what you've just accomplished. And that's certainly something that I'm guilty of as well. But if there is a time to enjoy yourselves, highly recommend that you do it tonight. There's no time like the present, so never take for granted the opportunity to celebrate with friends, to celebrate with family, even if you don't think there's great things going on in your life that you should be celebrating. Celebrate the fact that you've got some great football games to watch. Celebrate the fact that you're still going strong for another day and another year once that clock strikes midnight. Hopefully you guys, you do so responsibly though. Celebrate responsibly. Get a designated driver. Do not overindulge yourselves. Keep everybody else safe out there on the roads. Keep all your friends safe. Look out for one another. And hope you guys have a great and very happy New Year. Enjoy yourself on New Year's Eve. With that out of the way, before I get into this great podcast with Evan Silva, and it is pretty good, I will give you a little bit of a foreshadowing. I do want to go ahead and mention over at my website, sharpfootballanalysis.com, I mentioned this before, and maybe you didn't do anything about it, although a number of you guys did. But don't forget, it is bowl season. It is NFL playoff time. This is the best time of the year for me. So far, I am hitting 6-0. That's 100% on bowl game recommendations. We obviously have the college bowl games, college playoff games later today. We've got about 6 bowl games on New Year's Day. We got another handful on Saturday, and then we kick off Week 17, and then we start digging right into the playoffs. The past 3 weeks in the NFL plus college bowls, I'm 21-5. That's 81%. I'm not going to promise that I'm going to continue to keep that up, but I am going to promise that I'm going to put a lot of work into every single recommendation that I give out to my clients, and going to do my best to continue this strong season where I'm hitting 68% over the course of the entire year in NFL totals. Now, NFL totals, obviously, guys, as you know from playing daily fantasy, really do factor into how you look at games, how you break down games, how you understand which teams might have the edges in terms of pace, which ones might be able to produce points on the board. And it's going to be really hard to find somebody with a long-term track record, years and years, or just even a single season track record like I'm getting on board this season at 68% over the course of the year. For the recommendations I give clients betting on these games over at sharpfootballanalysis.com, I have a package available over there which will allow you to get on board for the college bowls and NFL playoffs, and you don't have to pay anything for 6 full months. So I highly encourage you guys, if you are interested in betting on some of these games, it's not just the recommendations that I offer, but there's a lot of analysis, very detailed write-ups that I share with my clients, and should give you a really keen insight into how I'm looking at these games, and use it for what you wish, whether you're betting on these games or looking for edges from a daily fantasy perspective. So head on over to sharpfootballanalysis.com and check out pay in 6 months if you're so inclined. With that said, let's dive right into this podcast where Evan Silva and I start right off the bat talking about strategies. And let me go ahead and remind you again, subscribe to this podcast. This is Sharp Football Analysis Podcast. We're going to be with you guys every single week throughout the NFL playoffs. So hopefully you guys are enjoying this. The feedback that we're getting has been great. Evan and I really do try our best to give you guys a lot of insight, a lot of information, and most of all, things that you're not going to hear from other podcasts. The slant that Evan and I collectively meet in the middle with, from approaching things from two totally different backgrounds, two different trains of thought, gives you guys a lot of good information that you can utilize and then judge for yourself what positions you're going to make this upcoming week from a daily fantasy or a sports betting perspective. But you're getting hours and hours of research in every single one of these podcasts. All right, guys, we are now joined by the man himself, Roto World's finest, Evan Silva, fresh off of a lovely Christmas, heading into week 17, juiced up, ready to finish out the regular season strong, and already looking at the playoffs around the corner. Good evening, and how are you doing, Evan?
Good evening, Warren. I'm doing awesome, and I'm ready for this final 16-game slate. I think this is a really good week in daily fantasy to play head-to-heads. It's really the last week until next September that it's smart to play head-to-heads. And so I'll have a lot of head-to-head action out there in daily fantasy this week.
Excellent. And let's just go ahead and start off right there, just to give you guys a heads up on how we're going to break some things down. Evan and I first are going to talk a little bit about strategy this week versus the playoffs, because Evan's got some great insight there. And then we're going to go into, we'll just go ahead and start talking a little bit about Chip Kelly, because that news just broke a day or so ago. And obviously it's the talk of the town, and Evan's got a lot of information to share there. And I've made some pretty bold statements about Chip Kelly throughout the course of the season, and I'll have some things to add as well. And then we're going to get down to business of breaking down some of these key games. There's a handful of really intriguing games. Some matter to both teams. Many matter to only one team. From playoff potential, it does not necessarily mean the other team is not going to try hard or care or be extremely motivated. So they might still matter to both teams. But for the playoffs, some of it matters just to one of the teams. And then we're going to talk, obviously, about some of the DFS plays or fades and what Evan likes out there on the board. But first, before we get into some of the strategy, Evan, why don't you go ahead and give everybody that critical information, how they can follow you on Twitter, how can they keep in touch with you with regard to all your great work over at rotoworld.com.
You can check me out on Twitter at Evan Silva, and my article will be up later this week. It's called Matchups. It's a condensed version for Week 17. I don't look at every single player, but I will look at a lot of ideas for daily fantasy this week, and some players that stand out to me as particularly good options, and we'll discuss a bunch of that on this particular podcast.
Excellent. Yeah, and Evan obviously produces these articles. He's quite modest, but these are definitely go-to articles throughout the course of the season. They come up on rotoworld.com. He does great work. I highly encourage you, no matter where he ultimately brings himself in next year, whether we still find him at Roto World, whether or not he's now being employed by some huge fancy company giving him millions and millions for his opinion. You can always follow him at Evan Silva. So that's the key place. I highly encourage you guys just to stick with him there and take care of all the good information he will provide next year as well. With that said, Evan, let's go ahead and start talking about strategy. We know it's week 17. We know some of these teams are banged up. Some reserve players are in there. But it's difficult to figure out what the best players to start are this week, but there's still a lot of options. And those options dwindle and disappear when you get to the postseason, when there's markedly fewer games, only 4 as opposed to 16, so that slate gets cut in 4. And we have to look now at, there's a bigger board to take advantage of. What's your strategy this week versus next week? I know you kind of gave a little teaser on that, but go ahead and fill everybody in on exactly what you're planning on doing and why you're planning on doing it.
So when I use the term cash games, I'm talking about head-to-heads and 50-50s. And one of the ideas behind trying to get a lot of action when you're playing head-to-head against one person, or you're playing in 50-50s where it'll be like 40 people, and if you finish in the top half, you finish in the top 20, you double your money. One of the thinkings behind that is that you're hoping that your opponents make mistakes in their lineups, and it's not all about just about you building the best possible lineup that you can. Obviously, you want to do that, but you also want to have an edge, and that's why you try to get a lot of action, maybe against more novice players, players that aren't changing their lineups on Sunday morning. All those sort of things. So you can get those kind of edges when there's a 16-game slate. You're more likely to get a few edges here and there, when there's a 16-game slate. When there's only a 4-game slate, and people will be a little bit more focused. Certainly there will be fewer mistakes made in setting lineups. You probably don't want to play as much head-to-head actions because, it's going to be the probability that somebody makes because there are so many plays on the board, there are more chances for your opponent to make a mistake. And when there are fewer plays on the board, that probability decreases. So during the playoffs, I think it makes the most sense to just play for fun. Like when we played on the Thursday slate, it's just a 3-game slate, and it's fun to have some action, on Thanksgiving. It's fun to have some action on playoff weekend, but, that's not really the time to grind. This is the last weekend to grind.
It is the last weekend to grind. It's the last chance really to have a more diversified lineup, as you kind of alluded to, and try to go after some of the players that you think might present bigger value because, let's face it, we're looking at the wild card weekend next week, and we kind of already know what some of these potential matchups are going to be, right? There's only so many permutations of what can and will happen next week in terms of who's going to be facing who. And so there's already some thought process there as to, you're going to like the Redskins players against this particular defense, or are you not? And a lot of the time, you know this better than me, there's probably a lot of group think that goes on in daily fantasy. It's only natural in every environment, as a society, that there's a few guys who are going to think differently, but the majority of people are going to look at the matchup. And so if there's a sweet matchup that looks tremendous, a lot of people are probably going to be on that same lineup. So the edges in daily fantasy are probably going to come if you can hit on some of those lesser-owned players and have them make an imprint. But this week you got more opportunities. So that's some great advice I hadn't actually pondered before. So I'm sure other people are going to be looking into that as well. So definitely, guys, this is coming out here middle of the week before week 17. But you're probably, before we record our playoff edition, our wild card edition of the podcast, you're probably already maybe going to start looking at lineups. So take Evan's advice into account next week when you're starting to make some of those wild card lineups that playing in some of these head-to-heads or 50-50s might not be as advantageous as you perhaps previously thought. With that said, speaking of going back on what you previously thought and rethinking some things, let's talk about the Eagles rethinking their relationship with Chip Kelly. Obviously, we saw the news earlier that they decided to walk away from Chip Kelly once they realized that this season was essentially going nowhere. And I know that Lurie was basically talking a little bit in his press conference that this was not a one-game or one-season thing. It was a trend. And when Chip first came to the league, he brought with it a lot of innovation. He utilized the players tremendously well. The team won 10 games, went to the playoffs. I believe they were beaten by the Saints. But that was a very good season. And then they won 10 games the next year but didn't make the playoffs. And now here they are. We'll have to see how many games they ultimately end up winning. But obviously the Chip Kelly experiment didn't go over as well as what a lot of people from Philadelphia were hoping it to go over. I can tell you from the sports betting side of things, where we sit, there was a lot of positive vibes about the Philadelphia Eagles heading into this season. A lot of people were looking at the Philadelphia Eagles to win the NFC East and taking futures at plus money on the Philadelphia Eagles winning the East. A lot of us bought into the fact that this hand-picked Sam Bradford quarterback was the missing link that Chip Kelly just needed to find. Once he got him implemented into the system, that offense was going to be extremely efficient. And that didn't end up going over so well. I guess Sam Bradford didn't. He's come along later this year, but it was too many weeks and too many games where he was not playing well and then got injured, of course, and it just didn't work out like a lot of people thought, even though until last week, if they beat the Redskins, they still could have won the NFC East, as remarkable as that sounds right now. But what are your thoughts on Chip Kelly, maybe the style of coach that he is, the style of GM that he was, and what he maybe could have done differently to avoid getting fired, or perhaps what you like about him, what other people are saying about him that's not true? There's a lot of ways to go here. I'll just kind of turn it over to you to let you share whatever you'd like to about Chip Kelly.
I do like him because I think he's an innovator, but he's going to have to make some changes in his next stop. I also think it's interesting that, not only did his offense kind of fizzle out over time, but the same can be said for Bill Lazor's offense, who came from Chip Kelly in Miami. Had initial success and then just kind of flamed out, the longer that it was there, and Bill Lazor got fired during the season, the Dolphins' offensive coordinator. It's interesting to note that there are no audibles in the Eagles' offense. And this was something that I think that Ryan Tannehill also became upset with in Miami. They would get to the line, and the quarterback is not allowed to make changes because the team is trying to play fast. First and foremost, the team is trying to play fast, and they're not trying. You don't see Sam Bradford, pointing out a linebacker and making adjustments before the snap of the ball. So they don't even have that really as part of their offense, especially in Philadelphia. No audibles. There was no vertical element, and this also was the case in Miami. There was no vertical element in the offense, especially so, though, in Philadelphia, because, number one, because the wide receivers that Chip invested in couldn't win, versus man coverage. Number two, what that leads to when there's no vertical element to the offense is a lot of 10 and 12 play drives. That's essentially what your goal is. When you can't throw the football downfield, you're trying to win with a lot of 10 and 12 play drives. It's hard to, string together a lot of 10 and 12 play drives in the NFL. I mean, that's difficult. No real quick score potential. in their offense. You would see late in games that they would start hitting a few throws downfield, mostly in like garbage time after they were losing. But, trying to win with 10 and 12 play offensive drives, that's going to be really, really difficult. And I think that was really the biggest problem with Chip Kelly's offense in Philly.
I'll echo those sentiments. And one thing about the audibles, I think that is a point a lot of people don't factor in enough when they're talking about performance, especially quarterbacks. There was a big change that happened when teams started to audible. A couple of decades ago, it was rare that a quarterback will come to line of scrimmage and actually audible. The efficiency that increases when teams started to audible more is very difficult to measure, but it is massive. The fact that a quarterback can take a play that was called on the sideline, not knowing how the defense is going to line up, and then take that play and change it or modify it to attack the weakness of the current defensive formation and personnel that happen to be on the field is paramount. And if you're not utilizing that in your offense on the pro level, let's face it, we talk about Chip Kelly college versus pro, but, it's one thing to be able to call offense and just dominate a defense like Cal or a defense like Arizona. But when you're out there trying to dominate, the Philadelphia Eagles, and you're out there trying to dominate the New England Patriots, you're trying to dominate the New York Giants or the Jets or any of these formidable opponents that you're facing week in and week out, it's going to be difficult if you're not audible in. And I think one of the issues with pace, we can all talk about pace all we want till we're blue in the face, but one of the teams that knows exactly how to switch it on and off is the New England Patriots. And they know that it's not just about how quick they snap the ball from one play to the next, but it's how they stay out on the field and don't huddle and have the threat to snap the ball that keeps your entire defense out on the field if they so desire, which forces you to stay in certain personnel groupings that aren't the most efficient given that situation. And Tom Brady can survey the field, audible, and if you try to substitute during that process, you're dead. So that's one of the big edges that Brady has, and I wish Chip Kelly attempted to allow audibles, number one. Number two, adjust the pace a little bit as needed. The goal of pace is to wear your opponent down, but it's not just physically wear them down if you're going 3 and out and punching the ball. Then your own defense is getting worn down. The goal is to play efficiently to score points. If the most effective way to do that is to keep a tired defense out on the field longer, then that's what you need to do. It's not just like a million plays a second. The other thing, before we go too far off the edge here with Chip Kelly, I've mentioned this before, but I felt that he spent too much time focused on what he thought was going to be the solution as opposed to analyzing results real time and making adjustments and modifications to the way he was doing things. Far too often, we said this before, it was DeMarco Murray on first and second down. And I was saying that from like week 3 or 4 into the season. And you know that, and I've written articles for Fox Sports and been talking about it on this podcast forever. Finally, he starts using these other guys, but this was well after the bye. And I said, this week right after the bye. If he doesn't finally figure out what to do, he's not going to do it. And he spent several more weeks still utilizing DeMarco Murray as the bell cow. And then he just cuts him off totally and starts using the other players. So I just felt like he didn't utilize the personnel very well. And last but not least, it just came down to me with regard to every single coach is going to have to deal with certain types of players. They may not fit your exact mold. They're not a guy you recruited to come to your school out of 500 kids who want to come to your school or more, and you're picking the very best out of all these guys. You have a number of draft picks, and you have a number of free agents that you're going after, and you have a number of players that's on your team. And you might not like every single one of those guys, and they might not all like you, but this is not a kumbaya type experience. This is winning games. And letting a guy who opens up the field completely, like a Deshaun Jackson, go because you're having disagreements with him, or letting an offensive lineman hold out and then just saying, oh, you don't want to be here? Fine, we don't want you here anyways, and just literally releasing him from your team is a scary way to run an NFL team from a personnel standpoint. Now Chip Kelly's saying, oh, I don't need to be the one making the personnel moves. Well, of course, you were so sick and tired of being criticized for him, you just want to have one less thing that people will criticize you for. So now, if you don't buy the ingredients, but you're trying to make the meal, and you find some ingredients that aren't good, guess what? You can then complain to the guy who got the ingredients, and you can make a big deal about that. I don't know. I really do love the innovation, and I love the differing thought process that he brings to the table, because I do think NFL is a highly inefficient game, and those coaches who are able to kind of squeeze and wring that towel out and get extra efficiency out of their teams go much further and do much better with their teams. And I think Chip can do some of that stuff, so I'm not totally down on him like a lot of guys are. But you're right, he needs to change some things. I think both philosophically as well as from a learning standpoint and process throughout the course of the season to better utilize players to their own potential as opposed to just what you want them to be in your own offense. So with that rant out of the way, hopefully we got some good information out there to people about what our thoughts are on Chip Kelly. Let's go ahead and dive into this Week 17 slate of the most critical, pivotal games for playoff seeding, and we'll start with the Sunday night game, which is the Minnesota Vikings against the Green Bay Packers. This game, obviously a key game. Green Bay is favored by 3 points currently. Line is now 45.5. Opened up at 48.5, down 3 full points already. It's only Wednesday evening as we're recording this. I'll let you go ahead and take the baton. What are your thoughts on this game where there's not going to be anybody rested? Injuries are a factor, but these teams are both going to be going at it full speed, full effort for the full 60 minutes.
I like the under. I know that it was 48 early in the week, and now it's down to 45.5 or 46. And I still probably like the under. But I have a question for you, Warren. If you were Mike McCarthy, how would you approach this game? You know, knowing the struggles that you have in pass protection, knowing the struggles that you've had with your receiver core, with your quarterback. I mean, the quarterback has not played well. Let's be honest. Aaron Rodgers has not played well this year. So I guess I'm kind of leading you here, but how would you approach this game if you were Mike McCarthy?
Well, first of all, you made a very accurate statement that I don't think enough analysts are willing to make. They all want to make excuses, and that's for the play of Aaron Rodgers. And I am 100% in the camp that he is not playing as well as he has played before, and he could play a lot better, and that would help this team a lot more. And it's not a slap in Aaron Rodgers' face to say that. I think to believe that he is playing the best that he possibly can, and it's only because of play calling and receivers, and some of which protection last week at least, that he is not making more plays, I think is a little bit foolish, and I don't know why somebody would take that route of mindset, because I do think a lot of it is on Aaron Rodgers himself. I think he has a significant lack of confidence. Some of it is deserved about his wide receivers, but let's face it, these are the cards you're dealt with. You don't have Jordy Nelson. Make the best of it. I mean, Tom Brady is a guy who has played with subpar receivers his whole career. And, I mean, granted, he's had a few really good ones sprinkled in, a few late years with Randy Moss. Obviously, Rob Gronkowski's in the mix. You can name a number of other guys, many of whom, though, struggled at other places they went. Deion Branch left there, played like crap in other locations. Some guys came from other locations not playing well, played suddenly great with Tom Brady. So a lot of these guys, you think, oh, well, no, he's a pretty good receiver. Well, he's good because he's in that offense, is working with Tom Brady is one of the big reasons that he's good. But Aaron Rodgers needs to perform better. So the way that I'm looking at this game personally is this. First and foremost, the reason I agree with you on the under, I think it starts with defense. And with Mike McCarthy's and the Packers' understanding of the way that the Minnesota Vikings call plays and have this ridiculous affinity to running the football on 1st and 10, unlike any other team that we see in the modern day era of football, it's pretty insane. The Minnesota Vikings run the ball, and I've said this on Twitter, if you're following me on Twitter, they're like 71% run on 1st and 10 play calls. They're 20% above average. Since week 11, here's the actual stat that I researched. Since week 11, so you're talking about the last 4, 5, 6 weeks here, okay, of their games. In the first half, so forget down distance, all the score, we're going to throw the ball more because we're trailing, we're going to run it more when we're winning. Just first half, on first down play calls, they have called 54 run, 22 pass. That's 71% run. The NFL average is 51% run on first down. Guess what? Very balanced. It's a passing league. We're going to be balanced. The Vikings call it 20% more than that. Guess what team figured that out pretty early this year in their prior meeting? It was the Green Bay Packers, who stuffed the run, and I believe the number was on 1st and 10 runs for the Minnesota Vikings against the Packers. Green Bay held them to 1.8 yards per carry, set up the Vikings in constant second and long situations that put them way behind the chains, and the Vikings didn't do much in that game in the first half. They totally abandoned the run in the second half. I don't see that changing. I watched the game that they played against the Giants, and yes, they were winning, but even when the game was closer in the first half, in the first quarter, significantly run heavy. So I think it starts with the fact that they're going to be able to stuff the run of the Vikings on the early downs. The goal for Green Bay, yes, your offense is struggling. You want to be able to stay in a balanced situation, a plus situation for yourself, and that is I can run or pass at any time. I don't want to be so far down that I have to always pass. And therefore, you want to keep that defense going against the other team. I think force Teddy Bridgewater to beat you, force him to go second and long, third and long on you, go the length of the field. But when I'm offense and I'm Mike McCarthy and I'm not trailing by large amounts and I have the option to be run or pass, I am going to utilize a tremendous amount of the screen passing game, and I'm also going to try to run on the Minnesota Vikings run defense. The one thing I'm not going to be doing is I am not going to be throwing the ball to Davante Adams. I don't know why they continue to rely upon him in the red zone on third downs. You got to utilize this guy in other ways, and I know you've got a great strategy on how to best utilize him. But you cannot keep going to him in these critical situations. Get the ball to Randall Cobb. Get the ball to James Jones. These are guys that you know are going to catch the ball and are far more, I don't even want to say explosive because there's no chance James Jones at his age could be more explosive, but they do more with the ball after they catch it, and they catch the ball more frequently. So I'm going to be calling plays and asking Aaron Rodgers to please target the guys who are going to catch the ball more often, because guess what? There is no worse way to run an inefficient offense than to have drops and have incompletions. I don't care if you gain 3 yards on a pass play. It is significantly better than an incompletion. And you cannot just have these negative plays where you're throwing the ball to Davante Adams frequently and he's just dropping everything. It's got to be wiped out of the offense. So, number one, the screen pass game. Number two, utilize more run plays against the Vikings defense that I think can be susceptible to the ground game. And then number three, mix in the regular pass game that Aaron Rodgers utilizes, quick pass type game, but avoid Davante Adams.
And in daily fantasy, I think that an interesting tournament play this week is Eddie Lacy, who in his 3 career meetings against Mike Zimmer's defense has earlier this season he had 22 carries for 100 yards. Last year in 2 games against Zimmer's D had 25 carries for 125 and a touchdown, and 13 carries for 105 and a touchdown. In Football Outsiders efficiency metrics, the Vikings are 12th in pass defense, which is pretty strong, and they're 20th in run defense. I mentioned the big game that Lacy had against them. David Johnson had a big game against them. Tevin Coleman had over 100 yards rushing against them. I mean, you can run on the Vikings if you put your mind to it. You got James Starks, who he's a guy who can be effective in the screen game, but he got benched last week on the first play of the second half. He's fumbled 5 times this year. He's lost a fumble in back-to-back games now. Lacy, a lot of people will be off of him, but he's cheap this week. And although there have been some ups and downs during this period, over the last 6 weeks, he ranks 6th in the NFL in rushing yards, and he's averaging 4.6 yards per carry during that stretch. So I think that in DFS this week, Eddie Lacy is a guy that a lot of people will not have the stomach to roster, but he may end up eating.
No, I 100% agree, and I can tell you the first way I looked in this game when this thing opened was towards the under. I agree with you on the struggles that the Green Bay Packers have offensively, and I think both of these teams are going to struggle to get those explosive plays. The Packers know that they want to make Adrian Peterson, they want to shut down Adrian Peterson and make Teddy Bridgewater beat them. That's the way that you're going to beat the Minnesota Vikings, force Bridgewater to beat them. Bridgewater surprisingly has been playing better the last few weeks than he was earlier this year, and he did the same thing last year. I don't know exactly, is it the time of year, is it the weather he likes playing at these type of temperatures? I have no idea, but he's closing out the regular season pretty strong, just like he closed out last year's regular season. And maybe that is an edge that they're going to be able to utilize, is him throwing the ball. We'll have to see the health of some of the secondary in Green Bay. But you probably know this better than I do, so let's just throw this back to you on the same game real quick. What about the injury status of the Green Bay Packers? I saw their injury report heading out of today's practices, and they look pretty beat up across the board. You want to talk for a minute about, some of the situations that they're facing? I mean, it's obviously early. Usually we record this on Saturday, and we basically know if guys practice this week, and therefore we have a good understanding if a guy's questionable, will he or won't he go? But early impressions, what do you think of that injury report?
They did have a bunch of guys miss practice today. It is Wednesday. It's the first day of the week. The guy that I would be somewhat concerned about would be David Bakhtiari, their left tackle, who, according to Pro Football Focus, is a top 10 pass-protecting left tackle. And the guy they replaced him with last week, Don Barkley, is one of the worst in the league. So that's a huge drop-off. Mike Daniels, their stud defensive lineman, I think will be okay. And they did get back Sam Shields, who's their best corner, who has missed the last 2 games. He came back to a limited practice on Wednesday. If we see him fully practice by the end of the week, he should be good to go. But David Bakhtiari, the left tackle, would be the biggest concern. He did not play against Arizona, and we saw what happened when they were missing their left tackle against Arizona. It got ugly.
Yeah, it definitely did, and I think this game is going to be one where these teams are familiar with one another. They know what's at stake, and I look for fewer points to be put up here than we normally would expect when you hear about the Green Bay Packers late in the season. Just not the same offense, and a lot of times offense drives the other team. When you realize you're facing Aaron Rodgers, like, man, this is what I've got to get out of my offense this week because this is Aaron Rodgers. I mean, hell, the guy's going to put up points against you. But, the Minnesota Vikings, they got pretty lucky in that game against the Giants. I think that offensive explosion is highly unlikely to be duplicated here in this game. If you look at them, they only had 17 first downs, but they scored 5 touchdowns. They ran for 218 yards. They just chewed up this team on the ground, but Teddy Bridgewater only completed 15 passes, only had 150 yards at 6 yards per pass attempt. It was not a great day for him, but they didn't need it. I mean, it was just a whitewash after that first quarter where they were up by 3. They went into the locker room at halftime up 16 and then extended that lead in both the third and fourth quarter. Giants just complete no-shows. Let's move on and pivot to talk about the AFC. And we have a unique situation here where you got two teams are basically vying for this final playoff spot in the AFC. It's either going to be the Jets or it's going to be the Steelers. And the Chiefs have already locked it up. Granted, they could move up, and there could be a scenario where the Denver Broncos get eliminated from the postseason, I believe. But although is that still accurate, Evan, or are they still there? The Denver's win last week in primetime locked them into the playoffs?
They're locked into the playoffs, but they are not locked into a first-round bye. Cincinnati actually can still overtake them if Cincinnati wins against Baltimore and Denver loses. Denver, is a 9-point favorite, but if Denver loses to San Diego, Cincinnati would actually take back the number 2 seed in the AFC.
Yeah, that's exactly right. If Denver had lost that game to Cincinnati and then lost this week, they could have been out of the playoffs. But obviously they beat the Bengals by 3 points. So here we are. We got two teams vying for this last spot. What are your thoughts on the first game on the board, which is the Jets against the Buffalo Bills? Currently, the Jets playing in Buffalo are favored by 3 points, total set at 43.
I think that from a matchup standpoint, it really looks good on paper for the Jets. The Bills are definitely without Stephon Gilmore, their best cornerback, who they placed on injured reserve earlier 2 weeks ago. Ronald Darby, who has been one of the best rookies in the league this year, their other cornerback, he missed last week's game with a groin injury, and this week Rex Ryan kind of indicated that he doesn't expect Ronald Darby to play. So the Bills will be playing with backup cornerbacks against Brandon Marshall and Eric Decker. And Ryan Fitzpatrick has been, let's face it, one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL, particularly in the second half of the season. So really like the way that it matches up on paper for the Jets passing game. However, there are a lot of narratives that you could come up with to think, this game's in Buffalo, Rex Ryan, he used to coach the Jets, this is the Bills' Super Bowl, all these sort of narratives that you could come up with to convince yourself that maybe this is, a close game, maybe it's low scoring, maybe Rex pulls out all the stops, I don't know what that would mean. His defense has been maybe one of the most disappointing units in the league this season, I would say, would be the Bills' defense. So we have to be prepared for, or we already have excuses for why the Jets, might fail built in. But I love the way that it sets up for the Jets' offense on paper.
Yeah, I agree there. I definitely think that the Jets, one of the most surprising elements about the Jets is the fact that their offense has played so well. And I was on the Jets last week against the New England Patriots and certainly was pleased with the end result there. They got out to a big lead and allowed the Patriots to come back in the game, ultimately won that game in overtime. But there's no doubt about it. This Buffalo Bills team is at a distinct disadvantage given the fact their injuries at cornerback, and this is a Jets team that is not like the Jets of 3, 4, 5 years ago, even 2 years ago. They will pass the ball a lot. They have a lot of confidence in their offensive line to protect, and that's one of the distinct weaknesses of the Buffalo Bills is that pass rush. And if that pass rush is not able to get there, which I would be pretty surprised if it were, remarkably enough, just because it's a Rex Ryan coach team, you think, this is, these guys are going to be sack masters. They're far from it this year. And if Ryan Fitzpatrick has time in the pocket and he's able to throw screen passes and throw passes down the field to Decker and to Brandon Marshall, it could be a long day. I will tell you that a lot of the guys simply feel that this is a typical circle the wagons game for the Buffalo Bills. This is their Super Bowl. A win here could keep one of their most hated rivals out of the playoffs. And I think if for that reason, there's going to be a lot of motivation. And we saw motivation factor in a lot this past week. We saw the Baltimore Ravens go in at home as a 10-point underdog and outright knock off, the Pittsburgh Steelers. We saw teams that really weren't given shots like the St. Louis Rams go into Seattle and get that one too. So their motivation is a very real element. But here you don't have the luxury. I mean, if you're betting on these games, we're talking about the lines, you don't have the luxury of catching double digits with the Buffalo Bills. You're only catching 3 points here. So you're going to need that outright more often than not. And I just think it is going to be difficult. It's a very formidable challenge. A lot will go in this game, in my opinion, based upon the play calling of the Jets. Will they get conservative at all, particularly if they have a lead in this game? Will they hang on thinking their defense is going to get it done? Or will they keep the pedal on the gas? Because we've seen them let it up, last week against the Patriots, and it's always dangerous. You got Tyrod Taylor launching the ball down to Sammy Watkins, what some of the results could be for the Buffalo Bills, get them back into this game pretty darn quickly. So I think the Jets, from their perspective, need to constantly apply that pressure like a boa constrictor and just choke them out early in this game and don't let that pressure up is the way that I would call this game if I was the Jets and their offense. We move on from that game to go ahead and talk about the other AFC game, obviously. Were the Jets to lose this game, that could open the door for the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Pittsburgh Steelers are playing the Cleveland Browns, and that's obviously a huge game for the Pittsburgh Steelers coming off that embarrassing loss to the Baltimore Ravens last week. What are your thoughts on the way and the manner that the Pittsburgh Steelers could rebound and what they might be able to do to this Cleveland Browns defense?
Well, the Browns defense is not good, in any aspect. I mean, they have one of the worst run Ds in football. They have allowed multiple touchdown passes in 11 of their 15 games. They don't rush the passer well. Joe Hayden is long gone. They don't have very good personnel defensively. And the Steelers were the most disappointing team, bar none, in the NFL last week. They burned the field in daily fantasy last week. Everybody had some exposure to the Steelers, in some capacity. And if you were on the passing game, which it looked really good on paper for the passing game, you got burned by them. And so what I think a lot of people will do that did get burned by Ben and Antonio Brown and Martavis Bryant is look for other people to play this week. And I think that will lower the ownership of Steelers passing game members. And I think that a lot of people will be on D'Angelo Williams this week for obvious reasons. Good matchup. He's been playing awesome. He's a great fantasy play. But the fact that a lot of people will be on him will also steer people clear because they don't, most people don't like to play a whole bunch of players from the same team in the same lineup. So I think that and also we saw last week that the strategy of the Steelers coming out and trying to run the football did not work. And I think that they didn't get the results that they wanted. D'Angelo Williams had a very efficient game, but they didn't get the victory. And so my guess is that the Steelers will go back to their bread and butter this week and probably have success and probably be great plays in daily fantasy because their ownership rates will be low. This has been, this is a team that we've already seen rip up the Browns once. You remember that game where Landry Jones started and then he got hurt. I think it was on the first or second possession, and Roethlisberger came in and lit up the Browns. So we know that they can do it against this Browns team, and they have so much on the line. They cannot afford to go out and sleepwalk like they did last week. And they have a realistic chance to get into the playoffs. This game is at the same time as the Bills-Jets game. And, the Steelers should also know by now that their defense is not very, it's vulnerable. And so I think that they should, they need to play with a sense of urgency, obviously, but they should continue to pour on points if they get ahead early. They can't afford to slip up here, and they definitely could sneak into the playoffs here if the Bills rise up in their quote unquote Super Bowl and knock off the Jets.
They definitely can do that, and get in there. This obviously is a game where the Steelers, as a road favorite, are laying 10.5 points, exactly the same as what they were laying 10.5 last week against the Baltimore Ravens, another divisional opponent. And a lot of people don't realize it, but the last time that these two teams played, granted it was Manziel at quarterback, but the Browns got into the red zone of the Pittsburgh Steelers 4 times that game. They only converted 1 for a touchdown. They were 0 of 3 in goal-to-go situations, but Manziel had a great day passing about 330 yards on this defense. They could not run the football at all that day. They ran 14 times, gained a total of 15 yards, 1.1 yards per carry, moved completely away from running the football. And that is what is really intriguing to me about this matchup. If I am the Cleveland Browns, how am I going to attack this vaunted Pittsburgh Steelers offense, which clearly is something that's out of our league? Go ahead and look at the opposing offenses where you kind of say, hey, Cleveland either won the game or played pretty close. You're talking about Kansas City last week or San Francisco a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago now. When they played Seattle, they lost by 17. When they played Cincinnati, they lost by 34. They played Baltimore. That was a close game. They only lost that game by 6 points. That was in overtime. That was a total back and forth affair. So teams that they've had their most success with are teams that don't have the explosive pass offense. The teams that they struggle with, Seattle, Cincinnati, and Pittsburgh, are the ones that do have explosive passing offenses. So if I'm the Browns, I'm saying my best ticket to success here is to keep that explosive offense out of sync on the sideline. And remarkably, people probably don't see this resurgent Browns run game, but against the San Francisco 49ers, this Browns run game ran 41 times for 230 yards. That's 5.6 yards per carry, week 14. Week 15, the very next week, they went out to Seattle, and they nearly covered that game. It was a game that they trailed only by 10 points at halftime and 10 points after the third quarter. They were tied after the first quarter. They did not have as many runs in that game. They didn't have many total plays in that game. They did go a little bit more pass-heavy, but they averaged 5.5 yards per carry on the Seahawks defense in Seattle. Last week, they went up against the Kansas City Chiefs, obviously a decent defense, and they ran the ball in that game 36 times for 232 yards. That's 6.4 yards per carry. So this team has been running the crap out of the football lately in terms of a yards per carry basis. And as long as they don't get into a big hole, they can continue to have these opportunities. The question mark becomes, will the Steelers play to completely shut down that run game and force the quarterback to try to beat them, which is what happened in the first go-around, or will the Browns be able to dictate things a little bit better when they have the ball in terms of running with success regardless of what Pittsburgh ends up doing and then passing off of that? I think my strategy, if I'm the Browns, is I'm going to try to keep Ben Roethlisberger on the sideline through ball control. My strategy, if I'm the Steelers, is have fun against the secondary and light them up like all these other teams have been doing, ourselves included. I think it's going to be a really interesting contrast of strategies. One of them is going to pay off. The Steelers should have success regardless in terms of throwing the football on this team. It's just a matter of how often do they have those opportunities. Will they easily win time of possession battle, or does Cleveland put up a darn good fight and keep this thing close? So I think that game is going to be pretty interesting. Let's move on to a game where we have some question marks surrounding motivation, but it's a huge game nonetheless, and that's Arizona against the Seattle Seahawks. And I'll go ahead and just kind of flip this over to you. If you would first talk a little bit about what this game means to Arizona, what they stand to gain here, and what does Seattle stand to gain here, if anything, by playing in this game and potentially knocking off the Arizona Cardinals? What are they playing for versus what is Arizona playing for?
So I know you've been critical of the NFL scheduling in the past, but they do a good job in Week 17 of leaving themselves open and being able to switch around games. And this game will be played at the same time as Carolina-Tampa Bay, and those games have, they're very much intertwined because the Cardinals can jump into the number 1 seed and get home field advantage throughout the playoffs if they beat Seattle and if Carolina loses to Tampa Bay. Now, it's hard for us all to imagine Carolina losing to Tampa Bay, but I also think that it was hard for us to imagine that Carolina might lose to the Falcons last week. I do think that Carolina will beat Tampa Bay, et cetera, but these games have a lot of significance. I mean, the Panthers have to win, and the Cardinals. I mean, and this week Bruce Arians said he doesn't believe in resting players. Anyway, so I don't think that we will see the Cardinals pull their players in this game, and then for Carolina, I mean they missed out on the chance at an undefeated season, and now they're shooting for home field advantage throughout the playoffs. So a lot of meaningful scenarios in both of those games. On Seattle's side, in the Seattle-Arizona game, the Seahawks do not have the ability to move up or down with their playoff seeding. They are going to be, I believe, the number 5 seed. Is that correct? Yeah, the number 5 seed?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, so they can't improve, but they're also an organization that is very much built on competition. It was a big deal when the Seahawks signed Matt Flynn to a big contract and then didn't even start him in week 1. They started Russell Wilson. That was a big deal. And that's what the Seahawks pride themselves on, for many years, that if there's a guy ahead of you and, you out-compete him, you outplay him, you're going to get his position. And I don't think they would back down, especially, against a team that they have a serious brewing rivalry with. The Cardinals have kind of taken the place of the 49ers, in terms of the rivalry. But I think they're going to go. I think they're going to go play hard in all likelihood, unless the game gets out of hand or something silly like that. I think the Seahawks will go play hard. The thing is that the Seahawks are also going to rest guys who are nicked up. There was an outside chance that Marshawn Lynch might have been able to contribute in this game. He's going to be inactive. Cam Chancellor, he had a good chance of being a contributor this game. He is not going to play. So, if they have nicked up guys, those guys are not going to play, and Cam Chancellor is a difference maker. So, I like the Cardinals in this game, but I think that both teams will go try to win.
Yeah, it's interesting because this is my philosophy if I am sitting here and I'm Pete Carroll and I just dropped the game last week at home that cost me playoff seeding, that cost me implications in the postseason. And I saw my defense give up 23 points at home despite only having one trip into the red zone allowed upon them. The St. Louis Rams still scored 23 points. They had one return touchdown. They had 3 total touchdowns in that game, got in the red zone once, scored down there. They did not turn the football over at all. They had 4 sacks on the Seattle Seahawks. Seattle turned the football over 3 times, did not have a single sack on the St. Louis Rams. Pretty crazy that the Rams and the quarterback would go into Seattle and not give up one single sack to that defense. Russell Wilson only passed for 6.2 yards per attempt, and the run game was completely shut down for 2.7 yards per attempt. I know as a Seattle Seahawk, I have to play Week 18 and I'm going to be going on the road to play Week 18. But do I want to lay down a second week in a row, basically, because effectively, even though they were trying hard last week to win, losing that game at home, do I want to follow that crappy performance up with an equally crappy performance where I'm just giving in to the opponent here? I'm getting healthy, but now I'm off of 2 straight crappy performances, and I've got to get myself jacked up to go play on the road? Or do I want to roll into that Week 18 game on the road as a wild card team, roll into that with a little bit of positive momentum, with a little bit of giddy up to my step, with a little bit of that Pete Carroll swag coming off, just emanating and stenching from the armpits of the Seattle Seahawks as they stroll into that opposing stadium? I think that's what I would go with. And so for me, looking at this game, I know that this line opened up Arizona -3, 3.5, some spots 4, and got heavily bet up, and now it's basically Arizona -7 across the board. And I don't know if I'm Seattle. I think it's too many points, given the unknowns that we have here with how Arizona is going to perform. Keep in mind, that was a massive victory that Arizona had over the Green Bay Packers in that game. However, that was not some type of ridiculous, explosive, outrageous performance that they put on there. Arizona only had 19 first downs. They ran for 4.7 yards per carry. That's very good, but it's not tremendous. It was still only 10th best in the league last week. Carson Palmer definitely did have a good game, but they had 9 sacks, and they were +2 in turnovers, and they scored 2 non-offensive touchdowns. One of the turnovers set them up, I think, for a very short touchdown as well. And that's 3 out of their 5 touchdowns came via that route. So you don't take anything away from them for that, but you don't give them extra credit for winning 38-8 in this blowout fashion when a lot of that work was because the Packers' offense was pretty terrible. And I'm looking at this Arizona team, and we're going to break this down in greater detail when they do have to play in the postseason, because they're not going to be playing in the wild card round. But when Arizona does have to play, I'm really interested to see how an opposing offense strategizes to attack this defense, because I really do think the frequency of their pass rush and the lack of hitting pay dirt in that pass rush in terms of recording sacks, they're one of the worst teams at actually recording sacks per dropback, yet they blitz more than most other teams in the NFL do. That's a pretty scary combination. It basically means that defense has to cover up guys. And last week that wasn't really the case because of the Green Bay style and Green Bay's offensive line. And Seattle does have some of those issues as well. Seattle does have issues with their offensive line. But Seattle's style is to throw the ball deep down the field. Seattle can do that. It's a new thing they started doing more and more this year as they've grown accustomed to what Russell Wilson is capable of, as well as some injuries to their running backs. They are throwing the ball deeper down the field. And that can be very successful when you're talking about an Arizona Cardinals defense who is without now their field general back there, their spark plug, the guy who gave them a lot of juice from both a sack perspective as well as from a interceptions perspective in terms of Tyrann Mathieu, the Honey Badger. So I think that there's going to be some potential to exploit that matchup. And I did not think it was last week against with the Green Bay Packers, because they're not that downfield type team to take advantage of that. You put Russell Wilson back there, and just like Teddy Bridgewater, you allow him to elude the pressure that's going to come, make a couple guys miss in the pocket, maybe even make one guy miss, or just roll out a little bit and use your speed and look with your eyes down the field. There will be plays to be made against the secondary of Arizona. Mark my words, I think there's going to be some big-time opportunities if Seattle does decide we're coming to play and we're coming to win this game. I don't care if it doesn't really help us out substantially. I don't care if we still have to go on the road, in the wild card round next week. We're going to try to come in here and make sure that Arizona doesn't secure the home field advantage throughout. So it's pretty intriguing to see what will end up happening there. What about some of these other games? Are there any other matchups, as we've been kind of going back and forth discussing these highlighted ones, that you think are worthy of breaking down in greater detail, that really intrigue you to an extent, or you have any tidbits to offer one way or another? or would you like to just jump right into starting to discuss some of the key positions and edges that you see there?
Well, I think that the Giants-Eagles game is pretty interesting from a daily fantasy standpoint. The Eagles have given up a lot of points recently. I mean, they've given up 27 or more points in all but 2 games since their Week 8 bye. In Week 15, they got smashed by Cardinals running backs, 37 carries, 232 yards, 3 touchdowns. Then last week, they gave up 4 touchdown passes to Kirk Cousins. Now they're on the road. Their coach got fired. I mean, and the Giants, I mean, I think they'll play tough. I think that they probably they got embarrassed against Minnesota. They get Odell Beckham back. Rashad Jennings has been running well. They've kind of committed to him in the lead back role. He's got in his touch counts the last 3 weeks are 20, 24, 17, 16. So, I mean, I like the way that this game sets up for the Giants offense a lot. I think that they might put up a lot of points.
Yeah, this game is really intriguing because before Chip Kelly was fired, I was thinking that these are 2 bad teams. These are 2 teams that aren't making the playoffs. Do they really even care? But it's the coaches of both of these teams that I think really would care. Not only do the teams not like each other, and probably there's a rivalry there that they would try to perform well to close out the season. Unless you are a gutless, heartless NFL player, which some are, you don't want to lose the last game of the season and go into the offseason on a losing streak. And actually, both these teams have lost their previous 2 games, winning in Week 14 and losing in Week 15 and 16. You do not want to go 3 straight losses to close out the season. But these 2 coaches, I felt both were sort of on a hot seat. I don't know if Coughlin would actually be let go, whether or not they'd explore options there in New York or not, I don't know. But what I do know is I don't think that these coaches would be in better positions with losing 3 straight to close out the season, and I think it was very important for them to try to win such a game. So I thought both teams would be playing pretty hard here. With Chip Kelly gone, I'm really intrigued by one thing and one thing alone. I want to see the strategy for DeMarco Murray in this last game. DeMarco Murray was the little whiny baby who went to the owner and sat next to his mom on the flight home and, complained to his mom about how he wasn't getting the touches on the ball and how he doesn't have any more confidence in the head coach who's not giving him enough touches on the ball. And then, obviously a couple more losses and the coach goes poof. And I obviously don't think DeMarco Murray deserved those touches. His production on the field on first and second down didn't give Chip Kelly any reason to play him. He should have had him on the sidelines well before that, used situationally only on third down and short yardage. But for whatever reason, Chip played him far more than he probably should have. Now, maybe DeMarco didn't like the types of plays that were being called and this and that, and promises were made and not kept. Who knows? The point of the matter is the guy got a ton of money, and staying on the bench and talk about it after the season instead of creating strife for a team that's trying to fight for a playoff spot. He's a very selfish football player. I'm pretty sure he's a wide receiver at heart with some of the antics that he was creating there and the strife he was creating in season for this team that's trying to get to the postseason. So long story short, I want to see if this new coach plays him more or plays him less, plays him the same that he's been getting played the last few weeks. But I do think there's obviously opportunities to exploit both these defenses. I think both these defenses are dealing with some injuries, are dealing with some issues. It is interesting the New York Giants have been able to run the football a little bit better, lost in the mix of them getting crushed with the fact that they were able to pass for 8 yards per attempt and run for 4.6 yards per attempt against this Minnesota Vikings team. They just did not have as many play calls and gave up tons of field position. Their defense was terrible. Eli was horrible with 3 interceptions and touchdowns off of those interceptions for the Vikings. But the offense itself, when they actually had the ball and we're trying to make plays, was okay. They just stunk on third down, which is one of the problems that they've had, going 1 of 11 on third down. So I don't know that I'll do anything here in this game whatsoever, but I do think both these teams will be playing motivated. And I do think that it would be ridiculous for Eli Manning not to heavily target Odell Beckham. And I'll be curious to see how he performs in this game when not having to go up against Josh Norman and that other Carolina Panthers defense, if he continues acting crazy or if he settles himself down. But I know you have some interesting hot takes on DeMarco Murray, so why don't we just go ahead and get right into those, because those are fun to discuss.
I just don't think he's good anymore. I think that you could start to see it down the stretch with the Cowboys the previous season. His rushing efficiency dipped just in terms of yards per carry, and I thought he looked slower. And I thought he looked slow this entire season, really. I mean, not enough speed to get around the edge. You know, he looks like a guy who's been just beat down, and he's like started to stiffen up, and he's not as good of an athlete as he used to be. And I think it shows up particularly in the passing game, where he's super ineffective in the passing game compared to what he used to be. He used to be one of the best passing game backs in football. Just looks stiff and run down, and doesn't really have much burst anymore. You know, I don't think he's a very good player anymore, to be perfectly frank. And I think that, you know, Ryan Matthews was very clearly the superior running back this year. And it's not just a system thing to me. It's like Ryan Matthews is better at football than DeMarco Murray by a significant margin.
There's no doubt about that. I 100% agree with you there, and I think it is a very interesting take, and I don't disagree with that one bit. I think it leads into a small discussion, which obviously we could expand upon this in an off-season podcast or some form heading into the draft potentially, but it really speaks to, do you want to pay running backs a second contract, especially a running back who would be going to a new scheme, a scheme that was different from the one he may have had so much success in? Is that the type of player that you want to give a lot of money to? Because we know that running backs are not the future of the NFL. They're the past of the NFL. A lot of teams can substitute in running backs and not see a tremendous drop-off. Yes, there are dynamic players out there like Deion Lewis and how much impact he gave to the New England Patriots. And those types of players certainly are missed. I'm not saying that running backs are a dime a dozen and easily replaceable. But what I am saying is that, are they worthy of paying tremendous amounts of money to, given the fact that passing contributes over 4 times more to total offensive efficiency in the NFL and point production than does rushing the football in today's NFL with passing-based rules and edges from that perspective? So I thought it was a foolish decision from Chip Kelly to try to bring somebody in like that. You already had, and we don't need to go rehash this whole thing about who was bet right and wrong, but LaShawn McCoy already had success in your system. And correct me if I'm wrong, but did they end up giving DeMarco more guaranteed than they potentially would have given to LaShawn? I don't know if that number would. So it makes no sense to me that you have a proven guy in the system. You want to pay more to a guy who you think is a better running back, but you don't know if he's going to work for your system. I just don't. It's one thing for the Vikings to re-sign Adrian Peterson. What are they going to do? It's kind of like the situation with the Bengals and Andy Dalton. You know, what are they going to do? Are they going to walk away from a guy who's gotten them to the playoffs a bunch and has a potential decent career in front of him, even though his ceiling isn't nearly as high? It's very difficult to convince fans that they're making the right move by not going with Andy Dalton. And Adrian Peterson with the Vikings is the same type of situation. At some point, he is going to get too old and expensive. DeMarco Murray is not yet too old, but I believe he was too expensive to believe that he would be able to change a scheme and fit your new scheme when you have no evidence that he's had any success in that type of scheme. And I'll just throw in a sidebar here, and then we'll start talking about some of these position by position discussion on Week 17 in DFS, but totally different topic. How about A.J. McCarron? How about some of these lower round draft pick quarterbacks with a little bit of time in a system getting an opportunity? And if I'm a team, I am every other year using a low round draft pick on a quarterback. I'm going to have a very rigorous scouting department focused not on the cream of the crop quarterbacks because they're out of my league for what I can deal with. I'm looking at the metrics and the measurables and the production of some of these lower round quarterbacks and what I think will translate best into success within my current offense. And I'm drafting one at least every other year because you run into a situation where and I'm not saying that this would be successful. I'm just throwing the theory out there because we don't even know, we don't have a sample size if he's good enough. But what if the Bengals don't sign Dalton and they go with a guy like A.J. McCarron? And what if in a few years they decide to go with another quarterback who they drafted? Think of all the money that they would have to spend on defense and on wide receivers and keeping A.J. Green and Tyler Eifert and all these guys that they are going to have to pay and keeping a ridiculously strong offensive line there and having really strong above-average quarterback play. It's not going to be the best in the league, but it's going to be very efficient, very above average. And I think with a great offensive line and an above-average cheap quarterback and a really good defense, you can do a lot of things in the NFL. And I don't know that it's necessary with the way that franchise quarterbacks are being priced and how you can be screwed if one of them gets injured. Your whole season is down the tubes if you don't have an adequate backup. With spending significant amounts of money, and I'm not suggesting the Patriots get rid of Brady or the Packers get rid of Rodgers, but there's a lot of other teams around the league who could learn from something like that. In my opinion, at least somebody should try it out. Utilize a strategy like that, and not give some of these guys who, Joe Flacco, okay? Joe Flacco, Andy Dalton. These are decent quarterbacks, but I just don't think, I know they're worth the money in today's market compared to what other guys are getting. I just don't think that that's a smart investment from my perspective. So that's a totally different sidebar there. Let's get back to the point of this podcast and let's talk about Week 17 and let's talk about quarterbacks. Who do you like this week in terms of matchups and edges that you see on this Week 17 slate?
Really like Eli Manning. Everybody saw what happened with Kirk Cousins last Saturday night. Since the Eagles' Week 8 bye, opposing quarterbacks have 24 touchdowns and 4 interceptions against them. I know that you said you think that the Eagles might be competitive in this game, and I understand that, but they're also their coach just got fired. They're going on the road with nothing to play for. So I don't think it would surprise anybody if they didn't show up. I think that's certainly, a possibility. And Eli Manning gets back Odell Beckham. And Eli Manning has been a good fantasy quarterback with Odell Beckham for the last 2 seasons. I kind of like Brian Hoyer coming back from his concussion against the Jaguars. Jaguars have terrible pass defense, pretty good run defense, so they force opponents to lean heavily on throwing the football. I think DeAndre Hopkins is an awesome play this week. I really like Nate Washington as well, and the kid Jalen Strong, third-round rookie out of Arizona State, has started to come on and play meaningful snaps, and he's a big-bodied receiver who can run a little bit. And I like him as a number 3 for Hoyer coming back in a good matchup. And then we touched on Roethlisberger. I think he is a great tournament play this week against the Browns. And I think that we should always have exposure to Cam Newton in a stack with Greg Olsen. This is a very important game for the Panthers. They lost for the first time in a long time last week against Atlanta, and they're going to be this is very important for them. And I think that Cam will go back to his guy, his guy who's been there for him all season, Greg Olsen. And I think the Panthers will have a really good day offensively against Tampa Bay.
Yeah, that is a massively important game for them to try to get a little bit of their swagger back, because obviously we know they don't play for another couple of weeks. And although I don't have the numbers to back this up, maybe it's just conjecture, but I just don't like the thought of botching a couple of games to head into the playoffs. I don't necessarily think that you need to have positive momentum, but having extreme negative momentum is not necessarily a recipe for success. And I do seem to remember a number of these wild card teams winning games that they had to win to close out the season, and then winning in the wild card round and going in to play some of these teams that had first round byes. And I think back to the 2005 Pittsburgh Steelers. I think back to the Giants. I think back to some of these teams where they just had to win. They did it as wild card teams, and they were in this mindset: we're going to go on the road, we're going to win games, and that's what we have to do. And that's why I kind of think that the Seattle Seahawks should try hard this week. I hope that they would. And why I think the Carolina Panthers should try to get that bad taste out of their mouth. I mean, Cam Newton throwing 3.8 yards per pass attempt is unacceptable. And with the way that they were running the football against the Falcons last week, it's 7.8 yards per carry. And the way that run defense held down the Atlanta Falcons to only 2.6 yards per carry, it was really incredible to see this light switch completely flip, where that hourglass turned, a partial revolution. And instead of Matt Ryan being the crappy quarterback who couldn't get anything done, and Cam Newton being this great guy who's hitting all these clutch plays, Matt Ryan's out there averaging 9.9 yards per pass attempt and posting a 118 rating. Cam Newton is averaging 3.8 yards per pass attempt and posting a 65 quarterback rating. So I think this is a perfect defense to get that bad taste out of your mouth. We know that the Buccaneers, and this was one of the games where I thought that there could be, if this team was undefeated heading into this week, I thought there could be a legitimate chance, based upon how well Jameis Winston played, to pull off potentially a scare to that undefeated season, because I believe their run defense of the Bucs had the potential. Now, they're not quite playing as good as they had previously, but they had the potential to do some things against this Carolina run defense that put more on Cam. And what you have to do when you're playing the Panthers, if you can slow down that run game, is roll the dice and hope Cam doesn't have a good game. He did not have a good game last week against the Falcons. But the Bucs, Jameis Winston has been struggling. He's been more erratic. One interception last week. Great yards per pass attempt at 9.8, but pretty poor completion percentage, and did not get the job done when they needed to. And in turn, the Bears had a tremendous time advantage. And I think that's something that the Carolina Panthers could have in their favor as well, as a time of advantage, time of possession edge there, to be able to do well. Is there anybody from the, you may have covered this already, but from the defensive perspective, what defenses should we be looking at this week, where we either see a big edge, or potentially a team that doesn't have a lot to play for? The team that immediately comes to mind, to me at least, is a team that you wouldn't initially think, and maybe they don't have a great game, but the Dallas Cowboys playing against the Washington Redskins, who really have already admitted they're not going to be doing a whole lot in this game, intentionally trying to get their guys rested for next week's game after pulling out the division last week. Dallas has been playing tough. They didn't cover against the Bills last week, but boy, I really respected the effort that this defense brought, given the fact that their quarterback was so terrible in terms of 42% completion, in terms of throwing an interception, no touchdown. Leading this team, I just felt like that defense did not give up heart during this game. And yes, they allowed a lot on the ground, but they're playing pretty hard. What do you think about them, and what do you think about some of the other defensive plays potentially this week?
Yeah, that's Rod Marinelli. You know, his guys are going to go ball for him. His players love him, and they have a lot of pride on their defense. Their defense has been legit good this year. I mean, last year I think they did a lot of smoke and mirrors to make it look better than it really was, but their defense has been pretty darn good this year. I don't have a problem with them. The thing is that the Redskins, well, I guess they may not play with Trent Williams, their left tackle. That would be a big deal. I think Colt McCoy is okay. He's a guy that isn't going to make a whole lot of mistakes. Doesn't have a lot of physical ability, but I think he's a solid backup. But that would just be my devil's advocate take on that. I like Darren McFadden a lot because as a running back play, because I think that there's a chance that by the third quarter, Darren McFadden could be running behind the Cowboys' offensive line against Redskins' backup defenders. And so I like the way that running backs oftentimes correlate with the defense. And if you wanted to play Dallas D and McFadden together, I think that would make a lot of sense. The defense that I like the best, just in terms of cost this week, is the Colts. The Colts have continued to play tough late in the year. They have 12 sacks over their last 3 games. They are facing Zach Mettenberger, who's been a disaster every time he's taken the field this year. And he will be without his left tackle, I think, Taylor Lewan, due to a concussion. So I like the Colts D because they're cheap and they're in a good spot. They're at home. If you want to pay up a little bit, I think the Panthers make some sense against Tampa Bay. And I think that the Bengals make some sense against Ryan Mallett if you want to bet against Ryan Mallett having a game like he did last week. And also I like the Rams against San Francisco. Blaine Gabbert has been taking sacks at an incredible clip. And I like the way that the Rams defense correlates with Todd Gurley as well, who a lot of people are not going to be on this week. The most common roster construction in daily fantasy this week will be to pay up at wide receiver because you have Odell Beckham against the Eagles, great matchup. You have Julio Jones against the Saints. That's an unbelievable matchup. You have DeAndre Hopkins against the Jaguars, great matchup. We could dip down and go a little bit lower. Brandon Marshall against the Bills, Antonio Brown against the Browns. All these stud wide receivers in awesome spots. And I think that people will want to try to get 2 of those guys, and they'll want to try to pay down at running back. Well, one way you could differentiate yourself would be to pay up for a guy like Adrian Peterson against the Packers, to pay up for Todd Gurley against the 49ers, or to pay up for my favorite running back play of the week, Devonta Freeman against the Saints.
Interesting. I like the strategy of going against the grain a little bit there. What would be some of the favorite stacks for a quarterback wide receiver that you think have the biggest potential upside here this week?
Pretty much those ones that I mentioned. Roethlisberger to Antonio Brown against Cleveland. I like that a lot. Eli Manning to Odell Beckham should be popular. I'll be interested to see how popular it really is. I think a lot of people will want to play Odell Beckham, but it seems like people don't like to play Eli a lot for whatever reason, and he's usually low-owned. I guess, I can't take playing Matt Ryan anymore, so I'm not going to do that with Julio Jones, but I'm sure some people will just be on it because people love to jump to whoever is playing the Saints. Whatever quarterback is playing the Saints will always have a high ownership rate. So Matt Ryan may get that. And then mentioned Brian Hoyer and DeAndre Hopkins and Cam Newton and Greg Olsen.
Excellent. Well, great information there. is there anything else that you would like to share this week from a daily fantasy perspective? Any other types of strategies? I think you've covered a lot of ground here, given the question marks that exist, given the date that we're recording this. Obviously, guys, as you're aware, tomorrow is New Year's Eve, and Friday is January 1st. So we're recording this a few days earlier than we usually do on Saturday. A lot of injury information is not aware and not been presented to us in final format. So Evan's definitely making some of his best guesses as to where some of these teams are going to stack up with one another. We also don't have the additional information to get more coaches' quotes that we sometimes do along the course of the week in terms of what they want to do, what some of their strategy is, and that definitely is a slight detriment. But I think a lot of great information, a lot of great strategies here. Anything else that you'd like to add before we wrap it up?
I don't think so. I think that's pretty much it. I guess I should name, if you are going to put together a roster that has, where you're paying up for a guy like Julio or Odell Beckham or DeAndre Hopkins, you need to know which running backs make sense to pay down for. And the first guy that comes to mind, he's the most expensive of this group, would be McFadden against the Redskins. But you could also look at Rashad Jennings, who I mentioned earlier in the show. Great matchup against the Eagles. Has been getting consistent work recently. I mentioned Eddie Lacy as well against Minnesota. He's really cheap. And Carlos Williams, I know the matchup is horrible on paper against the Jets, and Mike Gillislee actually outperformed Carlos Williams in fantasy last week, but Carlos Williams was the clear lead back, played over 60% of the snaps, got 19 touches to Mike Gillislee's 11, I believe it was. And Carlos Williams he's kind of a badass rookie, man. He's an athletic freak. He played safety early in his college career, tough kid, and he will be the Bills' lead back this week. And when those teams played earlier in the season, the Bills had rushing success against the Jets. The Bills have had an incredible running game this year. They've been able to run the ball on pretty much anybody, and I think that they will be able to have some success. And Carlos Williams will be their lead back, and he's cheap in daily fantasy.
Excellent. Great way to finish the podcast out. I think that would be right in line with what some of the sharper guys are looking at from a sports betting perspective here, and definitely are hoping that Carlos Williams is a guy to step up. With that said, Evan, we appreciate you joining us on this last podcast of the regular season, the last podcast of 2015. We hope that all you guys out there, we thank you for subscribing to the Sharp Football Analysis Podcast. Definitely enjoy the feedback that you've given us, and appreciate you guys spreading the word, because Evan loves to bring the heat, and I like to bring the analytics and matchups from a sports betting perspective to try to break these games down in greater detail for you guys, give you guys a little bit of a different background to things than you might find on other podcasts out there. And I know that we're always happy when we can give you guys some new things to think about, some new things to consider. Is never a bad thing. So thank you for all the support this year, and we look forward to a very successful 2016. We will be back with week 18. This is a wild card round podcast. We'll do podcast every single week except for the week between the Super Bowl, right before the Super Bowl, where there's 2 weeks off. I'm going to try to steal Evan for a few minutes each time to go ahead and talk about some of these matchups and break down some of these games in great detail, and we'll go ahead and share that with you guys. So from that said, everybody be safe, be responsible, be smart when you're out celebrating the new year, and enjoy it with friends and family. No time like celebrating the present, and we look forward to catching you guys later. Thanks again, Evan, and you have a great week 17.
All right, man. Same to you.
This is gonna be a fun ride. This is gonna be a fun ride. Everybody one clap. I'm gonna play when I wanna play, do what I wanna do. I'm gonna say what I wanna say. Did I say anything stupid today? My role is to take the ball deep, take the top off the defense. To take the ball deep, take the top off the defense. If I can't get to it, Nobody can get to it. I don't shine shoes, I don't tape ankles, I don't cut checks. Great cash, homie. I don't shine shoes, I don't tape ankles, I don't cut checks. Great cash, homie. Everybody, one clap, one clap, one clap, one clap.